Good evening, everybody. Today, we have Gita Chadha. Gita Chadha is a member of the School of Arts and Sciences, Azim Premji University, Bengaluru. Earlier, she was a faculty member in the Department of Sociology, University of Mumbai, and she also held the Obaid Siddiqui Chair at National Centre for Biological Sciences, Bengaluru. Her teaching and research interests are in the areas of sociological theory, methodologies of research, feminism, critical science studies, and visual cultures. She pioneered the development of courses in the area of feminist science studies in India. She is currently working on a manuscript on gender and science in India. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Science Gallery. Thank you, my colleagues at APU who thought that it's right for me to come and speak to you all. It's so nice to see you on a very dull Saturday afternoon. And I believe we have 2 hours, but I don't want to waste all your 2 hours. So in case you want to stop in between, say let's now stop this whole thing and let's just talk, I'm quite happy to do that. And I'm quite happy if you have questions while I speak. I have, unfortunately, normally I don't do this, but I have about 20 slides, but some of them I'll just go over. Shall we start? So I don't know what brings you here, but let's just sort of assume that it's interest, curiosity, and something like that. Now, this is Rohit, and Rohit's suicide note. I loved science, stars, nature, but then I loved people, without knowing that people have long since become divorced from nature. Our feelings are second-handed, our love is constructed, our beliefs colored, our originality valid through artificial art. It has become truly difficult to love without getting hurt. And most of my conversations around who gets to do science, I now dedicated to Rohit. I do remember Rohit as a very vibrant young person who had attended something similar to what I'm doing here at Hyderabad University when I went there many years ago. Our common sense notion about who gets to do science, it is the meritorious, the talented, and the genius who get to do science. A quick round, do you agree? The meritorious, the talented, and the genius. These are the people who get to do science. Yeah? Is it true? Just random response, you don't have to be right, wrong, anything. Sorry? Sorry? Some part of it is true?
Yes, one of the ingredients.
Okay. What if I say all of it is not true? Will you get upset? Maybe I will, maybe I will not. But yes, this is our common sense understanding that if you're meritorious, talented, if you're genius, then you get to do science. Because if you're a genius, you get to stay in science. So when I say get to do science, I mean that you enter science and you stay there, okay? Both the things. Now the sociological submission, I'd say, is that it is those with structural advantage. What I mean here is structural advantage, I mean social structure, advantage of class, of caste, of education, yeah, of religion, gender, sexuality, various other structural advantages that you might have, the cultural privilege that goes with these advantages, and the power that you have when you enter the field of science with these privileges is what helps you to do science. Simple corollary, I would say, is those without the above do not get to do science. Sociological submission always will probably be contested by biologists, by psychologists, by economists, by various people. Just bear with me for a moment. Yeah? The question, we begin with asking, why do we see so few women participating in science? What leads to the glass ceiling? Why do we see more women in disciplines like biology and not in physics? What is the experience of women in science who make it? Do they get to do science full-heartedly? Again, I'd like you to respond, but I'd maybe hold the response in your mind. In my talk today, the focus would be in why don't women get to do science. I've set out 5 reasons as explanations and descriptions for the low participation of women in science. You might say, is it really low? We'll see some statistics at the end. At the moment, it suffices to say that yes, it is low. It's better in India. It varies across disciplines, across fields, but overall, we can all sort of assume that the participation is low. Let me add that these might well apply to participation of other marginal groups, okay, too, in science. So what are these 5 type of explanations that I will put forward and submit to you, which we can debate and discuss? One is science itself and not society, because it becomes our unit of analysis. And by this, what I mean is that very often when we talk to people about low participation of any group in science or anywhere else, our model of explanation is it's because of society. Okay? We'll discuss that. Second is lack of role models. People say we don't have role models for women. Let's dedicate ourselves to making role models. So much more, many more younger people will come in. Girls will get attracted to doing science. Yeah? So let's make role models. Why do people like me have a trouble with that? We'll talk about that. Third, gendered mentoring practices for men and women, they vary in science. How women get mentored, how men get mentored often lead to very different decisions that men and women might make. Of course, well, I'll come to that in a minute. 4 is the idea of genius as a hurdle. I feel that the idea of this genius is quite a hurdle for a participation of people from marginal social locations, including particularly women. And the deep digging that I will do, which is on some foundational reasons, which I link. When I started my very, very checkered career, which I'm still not able to fully really grasp and comprehend, in trying to study science from a sociological perspective, I was very keen on more methodological questions, more questions of epistemology and ontology and truth making, and I was much more interested in questions of scientific method. My own PhD was on studying the role of intuition in knowledge production in science. I looked at the creative process of 15 people in science across, and slowly you get pulled in into this question of the low numbers of women in science. I often thought that that's really not a very important reason, okay? Back then, I was like, okay, that somebody can study. I want to study the deeper questions. Over the last 20-25 years, a slow recognition has come to me, which is that they are not delinked. The fact that you see fewer women in science, the fact that you see fewer Dalits in science, the fact that you see lesser Muslims in science in this country is deeply linked to more foundational questions of science, its nature and its culture. And therefore, I have started doing this kind of a thing where if I am talking about ontology and epistemology, I will talk about low representation and participation of marginal groups and vice versa. So the first one, science and not society, structures, not just individuals. Okay? To answer these questions, we shift the focus from an individualistic explanation to a structural one. We put the spotlight on science itself. We start asking, is science not part of society? So when we give this explanation, science is not really responsible. Okay? Society is. What are we doing here? We are assuming that science is outside of society, right? That itself is the first correction we need to make. That like other social institutions, is it also not patriarchal in its discourse and practice? Something that we don't like to think about. We keep saying, no, the culture of science might be a problem, But actually science is value free. Actually science doesn't reproduce bias. Actually science doesn't do this. Science doesn't do that. So we tend to think of science as if it is outside of society rather than something which is deeply embedded in the history, political, social, cultural context of any society. So when we examine controversy generated by comments made by Larry Summers and Tim Hunt, or even what Raman did say about Kumla Sohni, how do we explain these? Okay, now let me sort of explain some of this to you. How many of you know about the Larry Summers controversy? I think it happened in 2005 or 6, very long back. And Larry Summers was the director of Harvard at that time, and he's an economist. Does anybody have some idea about what he said, which became quite controversial? Anyone? So Larry Summers apparently was at a conference. I don't quite recollect what the conference was on. I think it was about women's participation in higher education, particularly STEM fields. And Larry Summers gave 3 kind of arguments why he was explaining why there were fewer women in science. And one of the explanations he gave was that there must be something about innate ability of women, genetics, something about their innate ability, their genetics, which makes them incapable of doing mathematics as well as the men. Okay? Of course, this became a huge controversy. Larry Summers insisted that qualifying his statements more and more, this is not what I meant, this is what I meant. But the thrust of the argument was that there is something genetic about ability and about how talent or to do something happens. Now the danger, we all know about this argument, is huge. Whether it's eugenics, nobody is trying to say here that there's no genetic basis for things, right? But we can see the danger in which, so a lot of women in science at that time who responded to Larry Summers said this is not only just a very inadequate and unscientific statement about women's abilities, but it's also actually very insulting, they said, to geneticists who are looking at genetics in a much more complex way and looking at relationship between genetics and environment rather than taking this very reductionist position. Every time we speak to ourselves, to each other in a classroom, don't we go there again and again, saying it's something to do with innate ability. Mathematics is innately given. Do we or do we not? I'm going to leave that to you. But I, as a sociologist, find that a lot of this idea still exists of innate ability. Tim Hunt, a few years ago, made a comment. Tim Hunt is a Nobel laureate. I think he's a physiologist, I don't know. Again, at a conference in Korea, I think, made a comment in a conference of journalists actually talking about women in science. And he made something like a joke, okay? And we all know that we've all been at the receiving end of many of these kind of jokes. And Tim Hunt's joke was that, you know what, we should have separate laboratories for girls and women and separate laboratories for men. And his argument was that my own experience, Tim Hunt's own experience has been that in a mixed lab, he falls in love with the women fall in love with him. You remember this controversy? Yeah. Women fall in love with him. If he criticizes their work, they start crying. And a friend of mine, Chenika Shah, and I, at that point had given this presentation. I remember it was titled something like, "Why Are Scientists Afraid of Love and Tears?" You know, but that apart, it was an extremely problematic statement that he made, which became controversial. He was stripped of some of his laurels and things like that. But the kind of controversy, if you really study it, okay, was quite interesting. About a number of people, including Tim Hunt's wife, came in defense of him, saying he's a good man. His lab is actually quite non-patriarchal. This was just a joke. Don't overreact. Don't take it so seriously. We are all the time told this, don't overreact, don't take it seriously, okay? Tim Hunt, Kamala Soni, Raman, one keeps forgetting, but she was not given a job at ISC. She picketed, I believe, outside ISC and said, I want a job, and picketed. Some pressure, and Raman said, okay, we'll give you a job. And many conditions were made on her work, how he will approve of the work at every stage, etc., etc. But the one thing that was most interesting for us as feminists to understand the patriarchy and the misogynist mindset that exists in science and among scientists was that Kamala Soni should ensure herself, I believe, you can check it up, maybe I'm not completely correct, but to ensure that she will not distract the men. I leave it at that, and I'm watching your expressions, that she will not distract the men. Distract the men. Wonderful. So, if we have that kind, now these men, whether it's Lawrence Summers, whether it is Tim Hunt, whether it was C.V. Raman, or whether it is the number of hundreds of people that you encounter if you are in a scientific institution, who are more enlightened today, probably, but harbor some of these ideas of innate ability, of women being the Menakas and all of that, coming to distract these Vishwamitras type of a thing. They are Eves out there to attract the Adams. No? Young people are smiling. So, now, how do we explain these? These are individual bad human beings. Are they individual bad human beings, or are they determined by a structure and culture not only outside of science, but a structure and culture of and in science? If yes, then what is this culture is our attempt to understand that. And how do we change it? This is not to absolve the individual, of course. I'm not going to absolve Tim Hunt or Lawrence Summers or C.V. Raman or whoever else is saying these kind of things. But the question is, what is giving sanction for this kind of mindset to be present in science? Rather than demonizing individuals, we need to look at structures. Yeah? To be true to our intersectional understanding of the world, and when I say our here, I mean a feminist understanding. As feminists, we also ask the question, why do we see so few persons from other marginal locations, like race, how many black scientists do we know, ethnicity, caste, and of course class. If I do a quick exercise here, in terms of asking for scientists that you can name at the top of your head from India, top of your head, very quickly, honestly, top of your head, name of scientist. Raman. Omi Baba. Look at the names that we know and look at what class they come from, look at what caste they might be coming from, look at what religion they might be coming from, and that will already give you an indicator of who is doing science, who gets to do science, who gets talked about as a scientist and who is not. Yeah? So will you find very easily the name of a Muslim scientist, very easily the name of a woman scientist, very easily the name of a Dalit scientist? I doubt. You'll have to really dig into your archive of your head or your textbook or whatever you're with and say, oh yes, Saha, maybe Saha's caste, was he Dalit, was he OBC, what was he? And if Abasur had not written her book on dispersed radiance, on Meghnad Saha, this might not even have come out as much in the mainstream ideas of caste locations and of scientists. Does it matter? We'll discuss that, yeah? So, before I proceed, I've used a very sticky term, which is also there in my title. What is that sticky term? Sticky, no? Feminist is a sticky term, no? I shut my eyes, tell me how many of you in this group are feminists? Raise your hands. I don't dare open my eyes. Oh, enlightened. Most of the time we are bad people. Feminists are bad people. You ask whenever you enter a class, you say, are you a feminist? Some will say yes, some will say no, some will say maybe. And as the discussion progresses, they'll say, I am not a feminist, but I believe in gender equality. Oh, what is this fear of being a feminist or called a feminist? At the moment, I'll just quickly, for those who didn't raise their hands, are struggling in their mind to say, what is feminism? A lot of people say depends on how you define feminism. Depends on what you mean by it. Yeah? At the moment, I'll just quickly clarify and say it simply means a consciousness, a critical consciousness, which tries to understand two things. Gender, which is how do you and I become men, women, others. Yeah? We are not born women or men, as Simone de Beauvoir says. The ideas of masculinity and femininity, you might be born in a body, yeah, but what you become culturally is a product of conditioning and socialization. So if we start with that one idea, that the ideas of masculinity and femininity that we live and embody and perform are culturally and socially produced. If we begin to understand that, we begin to become some form of feminist. If we also begin to understand something else, that this difference, okay, mostly the binary till 20 years back, 20, 25 years back, of men and women, masculine and feminine, is not just classification in a scientific sense. It's also hierarchization. It's also putting some form of equality, inequality around, some form of power. And that is called patriarchy. So patriarchy is nothing but unequal distribution of resources. In modern societies, what are resources? Education, employment, political participation, power, right to practice faith, right to be safe, bodily integrity. There are some people in the world who are not given the right to birth. You look at the statistics on female feticides, on female infanticide. Look at unequal gender ratios. The right to live is itself controlled and constrained, right? So how do we understand this? Yeah, patriarchy. If you are somebody who is carefully attentive and interested in not only questioning and challenging these things, gender and patriarchy, but also invested in changing that towards a more equal, if I may use the word, balance, then you are a feminist. Why do you run away from calling yourself a feminist? Because the culture around you will tell you, these feminists hate men. I love my men. These feminists hate men, they want to cut their hair, they want to smoke, they are all lesbians. Maybe, and what's wrong with that? But on the other hand, that might not be the entire truth. Yeah? So the stereotyping that exists from outside, and in fact, if you really look at it in the world around us, somewhere in the north of India, there are yajnas done on burning the feminist Pishachini, the witch who's a feminist, burn her out. There's a lot of anti-feminism going on, so we're all scared. But my group of people whom I work with, women in science, for example, often run away from the label feminism because they say it puts us in a box. It ghettoizes us. We don't want to be seen like that. We want to be seen as scientists, not as women scientists. If we start seeing ourselves as feminists, we are in deeper trouble. So that's why there is a need to run away from it. Yeah? There's another word here which I want to sort of unpack before I go ahead, intersectional. A lot of early feminism believed in two categories, male, female. And there was an inequality between the two. And the idea was that we have to redress this inequality. But over a period of time, in the history of the women's movement itself, we began to realize that the women's movement came under a lot of flack. Whenever you want to ask me a question, please do. Don't doze off. I'll feel very bad. Okay? Don't doze off. Okay? So, in this critique of the women's movement, one of the things in the international women's movement that happened was black women came out and said the women's movement was centralizing, normalizing the experience of the white woman, middle class white woman, and making it universal. Saying that all women experience patriarchy violence, all women must give up on marriage, family, whatever, motherhood also. Yeah? And black women came and said, but this is not our experience at all. We are not only constructed as women, but we are constructed as black women. And black women have a very different experience from white women of patriarchy. It's not that they don't suffer patriarchy, but it's different. And the white women were not listening, saying it's the same thing. Similarly, in India, the same kind of thing happened, which is Dalit women came out and said, this women's movement in India, which has been going on for the last, let's say, 50, 60 years, is not our movement. Because the central figure of this movement is a Savarna, upper caste, upper class woman. And her experiences are normalized. It doesn't talk to us. Okay? There's a very famous, well-known thinker called Kimberly Crenshaw, who in order to address this problem, came up with this concept of intersectionality, which simply means that gender does not come without class, caste, religion, sexuality. It comes along with other marginal locations. So if you want to really truly understand women and their positions, we must take intersectional views, because then we can also explain why women become agents of oppression of other women. Upper class women become agents of oppression of low class women. Upper caste women become agents of oppression of low caste women. In the problem that we are handling right now, women in science, you see interestingly a lot of women in science, wherever they are entering, look at the profiles. I'm largely talking about fundamental research institutes. All generally come from upper caste locations. All generally come from the dominant religion. Women are coming in, but from these locations. Men, for example, from marginal locations are not being able to come in. What does that tell us? Right? Dalit men find it harder to enter than, say, Brahmin women. I'm not making this up. You can check up the empirical facts. Yeah? So now how intersectionality helps us to address this problem, okay? That not all women fall into one category. So therefore, it becomes the responsibility of feminism actually to speak to other marginalities. Okay, the second thing, role model narratives. You know, the state is very invested in making role models. That, you know, women are not entering science because they don't have role models, correct? Scientific communities are very interested in investing in the idea of making role models for women in science. Yeah, we are not making role models for Dalits as yet, but still, role model. No problem. It's very important. But what kind of role models? So there's a beautiful book actually, many of them that have come up. There's a beautiful book, one of the early ones called Leelavati's Daughters, edited by Rohini Godbole and Ram Swami, about narratives of women in science. Very nice, first person accounts. The first time probably that women were writing these kind of first person accounts as to how did they become successful scientists. Okay, what were the challenges that they faced? And there's a beautiful book then was translated by Zuban, the feminist publishing house, for children, for young girls. Very well produced, very lovely book. Now why do people like us look at that a little with suspicion and a little bit critically? Not that that's not important, it's very important. The problem with that kind of literature very often is that it sets up a heroine narrative. I faced all kinds of problems, and look, I overcame it, you know, and all of you should do that. I had a very supporting husband, very supporting family, and that's why I could come up. All this is extremely interesting. Our point, however, is that does this give the young girl entering science any realistic perspective on the challenges she's going to meet or they're going to meet? We would like more narratives of women in science to come out which talk about challenges of unequal distribution, of rewards, Bhatnagar Awards, Nobel Prizes, sexual harassment that exists. How do you cope with that? How do you handle that? I remember a conference that I was in some years back in mathematics, and one of my colleagues, very, very ardent feminist, went out there and said, all this is rubbish, caste happens, gender happens. And my colleague sitting next to me, who was our host, said, don't you dare go out there and say these things. So I said, why? She said, here we are trying to bring something positive out and encouraging girls to get into science. And if you come and say these kind of things, will the girls really want to come into science? I leave it to you to decide whether they should know or they should not know. I also leave it to you to decide whether these stories should come out or should not come out. Okay? Or should we say, no, let's brush it under the carpet. We'll discuss it. Narratives of Evelyn Fox Keller, physicist turned feminist women's studies scholar, leading feminist science studies scholars, who's written some classics, speaks about how when she got married, she had to and this is a narrative that you will see everywhere, okay? How she had to take the back seat, become taking care of the children, move into biology instead of physics, couldn't go for conferences. Her colleague with whom she was working would go for the conferences, get the visibility. She had to take the back seat. She moved into biology, then moved into women's studies and had to drop out of hardcore theoretical physics, yeah? She's white, American, okay? I think Jewish, but I'm not 100% sure. Then we have Evelyn Hammonds, a black woman who talks in an interview about being black and wanting to do mathematics. And in her narrative, something very interesting comes out. It comes out in the narrative of Shalini Mahadev here also, later, which I will refer to. She says, I was not conscious of being black in the ghetto that I grew up in. It's only when I went to college that I became conscious that I was black, and therefore my ability to do mathematics was understood and filtered through that lens. It's a beautiful interview. If you can find it, read it. Then Bhanu Subramaniam writes a beautiful fable. I think it's called Snow White and the Seven Detergents. Goes from India to somewhere in the US to pursue science, biology I think, and writes about what it means to be a post-colonial person trying to go into science in the West, yeah, and speaks about how she had to erase her name, her identity, her sexuality to fit into what it means to be a scientist and to erase all other cultural identities, to become a part of this, yeah. So in that sense tells you also how science, modern science, has highly been cast in a colonial paradigm, yeah. And then Ben Barres, most interesting figure. Ben Barres wrote a paper in Nature, starts by telling you that they met somebody at a conference and introduced themselves after presenting a paper, and the person came up to them and said, oh, that was a wonderful paper. Few months back or a year back, I listened to your sister and she wasn't as good as you, huh? And the sister was Barbara Barres. It turns out that Barbara Barres had a sexual reassignment surgery and became Ben Barres. Ultimate experiment that you can have, and Ben Barres writes about this Does my brain change? Because my hormones have changed, my genetics, and how much has it changed? Does it affect what I do as a mathematician? It's a wonderful piece, please read it. These are the kind of narratives that tell you about experiences of people who come from marginal locations in science. In my own pilot project that I did long time back, where I interviewed women in science, mathematicians, physicists, biologists, computer scientists, their love for science, and they had all made it. Their love for science is amazing, very, very there. They don't want to be feminists, but they love their science. And I started talking about childhood processes, and childhood processes that actually carry into science also. I'll share only one story. I was bound by confidence for several years. Therefore, I couldn't even write these papers. But it's been time. I'll share just one story of a person who was a mathematician, married to a physicist, and the story goes back to childhood, where this person's father, she had exceptional abilities in mathematics, okay, extremely prodigious. And she recollects how in the class, and this is for all those who are in science education, a very interesting insight. She recollects in class how her teachers used to be very intimidated by her and put her down. Oh, keep quiet, don't be so precocious. Okay, several years back, science education must have changed a lot today, and we've become more sensitive probably. So the story goes like extremely put down in the classroom. But the interesting thing was the father, who would constantly taunt this little girl, coming from a very upper caste Tamil background, and who would tell her that stop all this rubbish with numbers and all. And I had a son, younger brother, who was not interested in mathematics, but would keep telling her, stop all this, and would compare her to Avayar. How many Tamilians in the room? Who's Avayar?
She's a very old woman.
Very old woman like me.
So basically she was a young woman who prayed to the God and was granted both to be an old woman, so she could pursue her ideas of art and literature. So if she was a young woman, she wouldn't have been able to do it because she would have had to get married and so she became.
Thank you. So if you are a young child, girl child, who's very interested in mathematics, and you're told, Avayar Madri, you're behaving like Avayar. And Avayar is a scary figure. Somebody who lost her youth in the pursuit of knowledge and art and aesthetics, and this woman with white hair like me, And a young child doesn't want to look like that. And what are you doing to that child's psyche by constantly telling that child, if you pursue mathematics, you'll become like Avayar. You'll have to give up your youth, your sexuality, your everything, attractiveness. This respondent of mine, after marriage, had 8 miscarriages in order to produce that one child. And I kept asking her, every time she told me the story, even now I get goosebumps. I said, you did this to your own body? Why? She says there was no pressure from anywhere. No in-laws, no husband, nothing. I wanted to do it for myself. Is this choice or is this social conditioning? Okay, because she was trying to prove to herself that I will not be Avayar. I will be the mother. Okay. Anyway, you can connect this psychology to her decisions to not pursue mathematics at a front line, although she had all the opportunity, but to go and teach in a college, in a university situation, and take the second role and say, I'm happy with my teaching, I don't really want to do frontline research, and joined her husband in a frontline place. All these stories matter because for us as sociologists, stories are important. This issue you can read, it's an EPW issue which Asha Chutan and I edited, where we produced narratives to counter that role model narrative of actual experiences of people in science. Chainika Shah, a physicist who left physics to go into science education, Sumati Rao with her, who is a very successful physicist as we know, Vidita Vaidya in combination with Bittu Kondaya, again somebody who was moved across genders. They told me that, what is this, you're getting only Brahmins. They managed to get Shalini Mahadev along with them and Martha, and they wrote this wonderful piece about what does it mean to be a woman from the northeast, what does it mean to be a woman from Dalit backgrounds, and what does it mean to be a person who doesn't have clear gender assignment or whatever. What does it mean to do that? Science. Then there was, of course, mathematics. Sujata Ramadurai, who is a Bhatnagar avoidee. Jayashree Subramaniam, who's a damning critique of maths community and still works in maths, along with Geeta Venkatraman, who is the Dean of Mathematics in Ambedkar University. All of them wrote essays, short ones. It was difficult for them, but they've written it. Go look it up. It tells you about the boys' clubs. It tells you, Sumati talks about in her narrative about if she talks with a little bit of unsureness in her class while teaching, it is seen as a sign of weakness rather than a sign of intellectual openness. So you are taught to be strong, aggressive, right even if you're wrong, project yourself in that way, a particularly kind of aggressive masculine culture, okay, that exists in science. They all talk about it. I leave it to you to go read it and decide for yourself what we need more realistically, okay, as narratives of women and others in science. I would definitely push that we don't need only rosy narratives which gloss over and make the woman into a heroine. If we want to make a flesh and blood heroine out of these narratives, this is what we need.
Feminism, the term, because many people has different...
Feminism?
Yeah, different concepts. Some are against it.
Yeah.
They are saying
Mostly people are against it.
yeah. So maybe can you explain it a little more? The term intersectional part.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do a whole class on intersectionality and feminism. But I suppose this is not the place for it, except again to say that it is not an easy word, it's not an easy identity. Even more than that, it's not a very easy consciousness. It's a critical consciousness, a way of life. You know, it's not easy to be a feminist, especially when there is, the reason is that because any consciousness, any movement, any identity that will challenge the status quo, the existing power structure, is not going to go down well, right? And it's only when it is a collective organization of people around it, yeah, that you can, today a lot of women are very anti-feminist. It's not just the men. Men are in fact coming along much more, okay? But there are women who are reacting to it. It's a very complex procedure. Like I'm saying, it's a very complex process of how feminism becomes the bad word because it's demonized, okay? By the media, by the state, by the communities, very often. Arey, don't be such a troublemaker, na? Adjust. Compromise. Just now, this morning, I had a conversation with my house help who is pushing her daughter to get married. Of course, finally the daughter said nothing doing. Despite knowing that they are being asked, harassed for dowry, the boy has another relationship, all this is known, but she thinks, adjust madi. You know, it's okay, it'll settle down, it'll happen, right? And this girl who has no exposure to feminism like the way I am talking about it, right? Who's saying this is my life, I cannot ruin it, I will not marry, is the feminist. And there's a lot of clashes going on. Now that woman, mother also is coming from a position of concern. Arey, if the marriage breaks, what will happen, this, that. And the girl is saying, this is a question of my life, yeah? So, it's very difficult for that girl as much as it is for the mother, yeah. So in this way, I think a feminist consciousness is far, far more, See, till 2 years back, I would never use this. It was only at NCBS that I became very adamant and I said I will use the word feminist. Most of the time we advise our students when they're writing for scholarship grants and all, don't say that term. Because when I sit on the other side, I know the moment they see the term feminist in the research proposal, all the barriers come, okay? And the candidate somehow or the other is thrown out. Yeah, there's a lot of resistance to it. And the resistance comes because of the threat, okay? And not to say it's very complex. Of course, there are other reasons which are internal to feminism which have led to this problem. Because even feminists made certain kind of very problematic assumptions of who can be a feminist. We ourselves made a lot of those mistakes which are continuously correcting. You know, that a feminist is a person who will not marry, a feminist person who will put career over family life, this, that, all those kind of things. So, whereas that's not the case actually. A lot of women who are feminists are very radical in the way they marry, in whom they marry, when they have their child, okay? They want to have control over their womb. They will not let you decide when they are going to have the child, okay? Whether they are going to keep the child because it is a girl or a boy, they take that choice in their hand. So that's a completely different thing. We can talk about it, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of the background so that we can understand this question, yeah? One of the things that women in science face, especially older women who've made it and who are mentoring younger women, okay? Sorry, I will add the term, explain the term intersectionality a little more. We are concerned, deeply concerned with what happens to queer people in science. We say it's a very casteist culture, okay? The scientific institutions in India, but it's also deeply homophobic, okay? And if you look at the narratives of people who come with gender non-conforming personality, gender non-conforming life, will tell you how homophobic the scientific community is and how much it assumes that the cis heterosexual man is the masculine man. There's a lot here. I can't unpack it all, but just throwing some ideas at you for you to go and start looking at it, yeah? So the famous Alan Turing, if you see that film, what was that film saying? Imitation Game. Yeah? Alan Turing's, the film on Alan Turing, see that to get a sense of what they went through. Now, this comes from interviews with women in science as they mentor young girls in science, okay, young women. The dual problem of preparing them for the hard world of science and yet teaching them how to navigate it with confidence and energy, problems of the boys' club, of sexual harassment, to name two. Yeah? The burden of this falls on the older women in science. Yeah? And they themselves are deeply conflicted what they are preparing the younger girls for. Providing professional networks and building cultures of support and care, particularly in instances of sexual harassment and violence. Why I brought this a lot is because during the Me Too movement, we found that in India, a lot of academics from different social sciences and all were named as predators and sexual harassers. But very few people from science were named. And we were very intrigued by it because the community that I grew up in, my own field work, we had heard there are enough whispers of sexual harassment and much worse in the scientific community. How come nobody got named? And as we dug further, we realized that there's a particular problem, especially in experimental science. Apart from generally, you know, if the girl goes and complains, the references will not come from the guide, this will happen, that will happen. That happens everywhere. But in science, there was a peculiar problem. And that is, in the laboratory, if a girl has worked for 4 years, okay, and she puts in a complaint of sexual harassment, she will be assigned to another lab. The PI is never, generally not suspended. She will be assigned to another lab to address the problem. What happens in that case? She loses all the data that she had, her work for those many years, and she has to start from scratch. Imagine how difficult it would be. Would you do it? And then we say, oh, if she really has pride and onus should be on her, she should actually go ahead. No, it's the job of the IC to actually say, no, she should not be going anywhere else. Or it raises bigger questions of property rights on knowledge in a laboratory, which we will not talk about right now, because apparently it's a very complex question, the more I've been going through. But so very often older women land up telling younger women, just get out of here now. Just do your work and get out. Compromise muddy. Yeah. So this is another biggest problem. How to perform or not perform femininity. This is very funny and very interesting. Women in science are expected to project very serious images. Don't dress in flashy clothes. Don't wear jewelry. Don't do this. Don't do that, because you will look frivolous and nobody will take you seriously. So a lot of the mentoring happens about how you should dress. It's not even conscious, it's very unconsciously done as to how not to dress flashily. All academic women have this problem, even we have it in the social sciences, how to dress. But we will at least wear one nice sari for a conference and all that. Women in science, no. You have to look that shabby. Scientist who can work for 80 hours, which is what Lawrence Summers said, that women are inept and doing mathematics because they cannot give 80 hours a week. Why should anybody give 80 hours a week? Was the question that was asked. You don't have a life otherwise, or what? 80 hours to physics or to science. Why are you? Anyway, so therefore, you should perform femininity, and a lot of women in science, on the other hand, you see these images that come out of ISRO. Women with wonderful Mangalsutra saris, everything, good women who are doing science. So good Hindu women who are doing science. You should be like that. That's your role model also. So it's a very peculiar thing, but a lot of conversations subtly happen on how to perform femininity while you are a scientist. But you should still be the good woman. Yeah? It's very interesting. And this comes a lot from women in science who don't get married, who tell you, what do I do now? Okay? Anyway, and the last one is the biggest challenge, mentoring towards changing the cultures and discourses of science. Yeah? So mentoring is something that a lot of women in science are now speaking about. This is my favorite grouse. I hope I will end with this and not take you further in. So this idea of genius. The role models are male geniuses. If you really look at it, in pre-modern epochs, genius was a guiding spirit of a person, a family, or a place that helped in begetting, genus, or birthing. Okay? Over the 18th century, it became an attribute of the individual based upon innate talent. And see how it emerges with a certain kind of modernity. Historically, the genius becomes individual. In that epoch in history, that individual is a male, the man with the beard, whether it's a Karl Marx, or it's an Einstein, or it's a Newton, or it's a Galileo. Masculine, endowed with innate talent, God gift, gifted, committed to the pursuit of knowledge over everything else. Wife is there who will give food. Okay, somebody will take care of him. He's shabby, he's this, he's passionate and mad about science. So much of romantic imagination goes around this figure. Okay, the genius in every field often gets exoticized, glorified, and gains impunity. That is the most important thing we need to understand. And impunity from what? A clean sheet for everything else, including things like sexism, not working in the house, not helping the wife. That's not my job. Not in the institute looking at administrative work. That's not my job. I am the great intellectual. Misogyny and sexual harassment. We know of enough stories of sexual harassment between two scientists, male and female, and the male has been rehabilitated because what a genius, how can you let his career go bad? She is average. He's the genius. We have to protect him. We have to protect him, and therefore we will nurture him and we will give him total impunity. He's not even a boy who's produced anything wonderful, but he's still projected as the genius, future genius. So the impunity that geniuses get from all social cultural responsibilities is something actually very scary. And most importantly, genius has the luxury of time, space, and unfettered pursuit of science. Genius men don't have to go back home, right? And cook, feed the house, clean the house, take care of the children, take care of old parents. They don't have to do that. Somebody is doing it for them, so they can pursue science. If women land up doing that, they are in trouble, okay? Deep, deep trouble. You're not being the correct, nice woman. And women who have not married, who don't undertake these responsibilities also tell you that for them to inhabit the category of genius is still difficult, despite them doing the same things, okay? The idea of genius comes in the way organically, I would say, of women's participation. Do we need to change our cultures and notions of who and what is a genius? All our individual awards, all our awards in science, mostly all awards are given to individuals. Science is a work that happens in a collective. How much ever we deny that. Laboratories rarely get the award. It's the individuals that get it. Yeah? And we'll show you some statistics at the end of the presentation to say where is the skew also. So do we need to really look at this idea of genius and get rid of it? Okay, because it puts a lot of pressure also on other men. They're all the time competing to be this one genius who will get one award. It messes up on men's psyche as much worse for women. But it messes up men's psyches. They are constantly trying to be that great, wonderful scientist who can come close to being the genius. Yeah? Or at least performing that genius. I might not be the Einstein, but I can show my family that I'm Einstein-like. Therefore, I don't have to go for any family functions. I don't have to think of finances. I don't have to do this. Because I am the Einstein-like genius, right? So this idea of genius actually comes in the way a lot for women's full-fledged participation in science, because they can never fit into this idea of the genius at all, because already it is an idea disadvantaged against them. Now, I'm not quite sure whether I want to go into this. I'd rather have you discuss, but I'll just quickly take you into this. When I dig deeper, that's the fifth point, I would say that there are certain assumptions of nature that science makes, which feminists have unpacked. Nature is feminine. She obeys the laws of, right? Why does she obey the laws? Nature is passive. Culture controls it, science controls it for the benefit of mankind. If you're a little more political sensitive, you'll say humanity. Nature, on the other hand, can be seen as wild and uncontrollable, so needs to be controlled. Would you be persuaded by an argument which the feminist historians have made that this construction of nature sort of goes hand in hand with the construction of women? Women are seen as passive. Women are probably seen as wild. And I've quoted some people here. You may read this. What is the language that we are talking about? Why are we talking about the language of nature only as resource when we actually are as much a part of it, but we see it only as a resource? And finally, Vandana Shiva in India talks about, but unfortunately from very Vedic context, that Western modern science looked at nature in a very mechanistic way. And she argues for a more vitalist understanding of nature, which is more dynamic, will hit back at you, whatever it is. So I want you to not get lost in this too much. At the moment, I would just urge you to see if you can see a relationship between what happens to women in society, what happens to women in science, and the way nature is looked at as both feminine and in science. If you can at least open your mind up to that much, I think I would have done what I wanted to do. Scientific method is based on the idea of separation between the knower and the known. Okay? Some feminists, like Donna Haraway, have argued that the entire evolution theory, for example, I know if there are biologists will immediately get angry, but think about it. That some have argued that evolution theory was accepted and became the legitimate paradigm of understanding human origins. It was produced along with utilitarianism and capitalism. It looked at nature, the human species, within these forces. Some feminists have argued that evolution theory, for some extent, has not paid attention to women's labors. Because Darwin looked, arguably, at what men were doing, he could very, very correctly come up with the idea that competition is a principle for, to some extent, species survival, sort of reproducing the theory of the hunting, gathering model, man the hunter, woman the food gatherer. Did he by chance get biased? Or was he not biased, but was he selective? Feminist biologists, evolutionary biologists are arguing, saying that cooperation, and this is not just feminists, others have also done it, cooperation was equally, if not more, an important principle, okay, of the species survival. And women were doing food gathering, which was based a lot more on the ideas of cooperation than on the ideas of competition of the hunter. I'm simplifying. Don't get lost in this. Read up. What we have also pointed out is that how, for example, and let me go to the next point, let me not take you into Sandra Harding and others. So, in any discussion, very often you get told that this difference between sex and gender is biological, and you're fighting against biology. You're being unnatural, right? And so therefore, if you look at biology itself and see some of the research that is done on sex and gender, you look at it and see how often, and that I believe contemporary biology says that it has changed it. You see very often that it's the male sample. Even today, if you go and ask in the laboratories, do you even look at the female of the species, whether it's a Drosophila, whether it's the ant, whether it's a zebrafish, whether it's a fly? Are you looking at the female of the species? Or are you taking only the male in the research design and normalizing on that basis? I believe a lot of frontline biologists do it differently today. I don't know. Our suspicion is the same principles continue of taking the male of a species and actually generalizing it for everyone. If you look at the history of early anatomy, women's bodies were studied only for their reproductive organs, because the value of their body was seen in their reproductive function, so that was worthy to be studied. The brains were already decided they're smaller in size, therefore lower in intelligence, just like the blacks were. Yeah? Today, with the idea that brain is a much more plastic organ, things might be changing. We need to put a lot more effort into that to understand the human brain, to understand the brain itself, to understand what are the difference between the male and the female brain, why are we studying that difference if we are studying it. Are we studying it to reproduce patriarchal hierarchies and justify what we see outside in the laboratories, through the laboratories? Complex questions. The second thing, one is the level, the androcentrism in scientific theory comes because of selective bias in the research design, but it also comes with language. Yeah, in places, so a lot of people ask us, oh, you can say this for biology, but what about physics? And our answer is, yeah, it's more difficult to show it in physics, but let's look carefully and see the language, for example. Yeah, maybe, but the language has become so technical that it's often very, very difficult to detect any bias. But that's up to the physicists to do. The sociologists cannot even dare go there. Yeah? But on the question of language, for example, Emily Martin's work, have you heard of The Egg and the Sperm? Not used that. Egg and the Sperm. Read it, it's a classic. Where she argues and shows how the language of reproduction in textbooks, in journals, has gone through phases. The language of reproduction is the egg is passive, waiting, the sperm is active, energetic, penetrating, warlike. So many warriors, one egg fighting for it. That's the kind of language that children used to be exposed to. What is it doing? And some of my scientist friends say, but that is the way it is. No, egg is passive, sperm is active. Languages on menstruation, waste, death, decadence, denudation, or whatever. Okay? Spermatogenesis is far more wasteful. So much sperm gets destroyed, yeah, and wasted. But the language is not of waste. Every time a woman menstruates, the language around menstruation is the language of waste. Yeah? Why? Is it scientific language? And Martin definitely discusses this, that science educators, for example, are in deep trouble sometimes. They say, but look, we want to make it relatable. So we use this language. So these are political choices that we need to make. Just because it is relatable, does it become the kind of language that you should be using? Yeah? So these are the deeper things which I think are deeply connected to why and who gets to do so. I haven't had the time to look at sexuality, I haven't had time to look at caste, but I'm hoping that you'll be able to see that some of this applies to many other things. Yeah, the idea of purity, pollution. Many of you would know this. 13 women in physiology or medicine, 5.6% of 230 awarded. 8 in chemistry, 4.1 out of 191. 5 in physics, 1.8 out of 224. Bhatnagar awardees, there are a few more which don't feature here. Slightly over 3% of the total awards. And the numbers actually, interestingly, are not bad. Women in biology or in some of these fields, actually the numbers are not bad at all. At the elite Indian institutes of technology in Delhi, Mumbai, Kanpur, Kharagpur and Madras, the proportion of Dalit researchers admitted to doctoral programs range from 6% at IIT Delhi. This is from Andak, which is working very well on bringing some of these issues out. At the IIC or IIC in Bengaluru, 20% of researchers admitted to doctoral programs in 2020 were Dalits, and at the CSIR, a major government research institution, of the 33 laboratories that responded to Andak's data request, just 12 met the 15% threshold. The numbers are even lower among senior academics. IIT Bombay in Mumbai and IIT Delhi had no Dalit professors at all in 2020, compared with 324 and 218 professors respectively in the general category, which includes upper caste Hindus and some members of religious minorities like Muslims. In India, the term professor refers to senior ranking positions and does not include assistant or associate professors, where you might find people from marginal locations being stuck for very, very long. IIC had 2 Dalit professors and 205 general category professors in 2020. None of the department heads at IIC were Dalits last year, and 5 out of the 7 science schools of Jawaharlal Nehru University did not have a single Dalit professor. Again, a very progressive university. Some of the data. Look at what happens at the professor level. Narratives are important, numbers as much as are important, but narratives are very important. This is Shalini Mahadev in an interview, the one who also wrote for our journal, our special issue. Please read this interview. I've just taken one small bit from here. I was once in a coaching center preparing for medical entrance tests because I wanted to be a doctor. They used to directly and unashamedly ask SC students to stand in the class and tell their ranks. They would compare my marks and rank with other upper caste girls and remark that she would not get the same college as I would with the same rank as mine. Very common experience. In 1976, Rao Sahib Kale entered the School of Life Sciences at JNU alongside about 34 other incoming doctoral students. When the school posted the list of assignments of PhD students to supervisors, every single student had been matched with a supervisor except for him. Kale knew why his name was missing. In his class, he was the only one from the Dalit background. Are we overreading? I don't think so. Okay, done. Yes, nice to hear the clap.